Hi and welcome. Uh, just one bit of housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded and the recordings will be available on the New Jersey Bike and Walk website soon. Please be aware that the chat is also being recorded. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of Downtown New Jersey, a nonprofit education and advocacy organization who has been working to support revitalization of New Jersey's downtowns since the late 80s. I'm also a professional planner that has been involved with Complete Streets, Safe Streets, and Vision Zero initiatives across the state. Today, I'm joined by several experts. First, Mike Lydon, Principal Street Plans. I'm sure many of you have heard his name. He's author of a lot of blogs. We're also joined by Betsy Mistaglio, who's the manager of the Office of Transit, Bicycle, and Pedestrian Planning at the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. She's going to be sharing some great information about some tactical urbanism they've been promoting in that region. And finally, we have Robert Noland, who's the director of the Voorhees Transportation Center and PhD program at the Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy, who will be sharing some interesting research he's done since the beginning of the pandemic. After brief presentations from each of us, we will come back for a panel discussion and audience Q&A. We encourage you to use the chat to share your thoughts and ask questions throughout the webinar. Be sure to change your chat settings to share comments with all participants, not just the panelists, so we can have a robust conversation. Also note, while the Q&A is on, I'm not going to be paying attention to the Q&A, so please be sure to ask any questions or make any comments in the chat, not in the Q&A. So D&J helped organize this session because we recognize that complete streets are not only good for safety, they are good for business. Clearly, COVID caused some dramatic changes in how we do businesses. We found anecdotally that businesses that adapt did the best. You know, those who took in outdoor commerce and those who started doing e-commerce. At the same time, the towns that adapted also did the best. And again, it's the ones who supported their businesses with outdoor commerce and supported their residents to go use that outdoor commerce and also kind of went the extra mile to provide some type of entertainment or reason to be outside and downtown. Now that we've gotten a taste of that apple, many want to plant an apple tree. And this session will explore how tactical urbanism techniques that communities installed to meet demand for active and passive use of the streets, as well as those that supported our small businesses. We will also discuss how tactical urbanism is a good testing ground to work out the kinks before permanent installation and how to make the move from tactical to practical. Before we get into the infrastructure talk, though, we'd like to have Bob Noland set the stage by sharing some interesting stats from a survey he conducted about street usage during COVID. Bob, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. So I'm going to talk about a study we did and we're still working on, I should say, and just acknowledge my two co-authors, Evan Yakabuchi, who's a PhD student, and Wenwen Jiang, who is an assistant professor. Go ahead, move it forward. I can't move it, so whoever's moving the side, okay, thank you. So our key research question here that I'm talking about today is we wanted to see what public views are on the street closures that have occurred and outdoor dining. So, you know, have people and related to that, have people increase their active travel as a result of these street closures? Do they approve or disapprove of these changes that have been made? And whether, most importantly, whether people want to see them made permanent. Next slide, please. Okay, just a couple photos. You know, so this is the type of thing I'm mainly talking about. You see New Brunswick on the left that closed off parts of George Street for outdoor dining, and then Witherspoon Street and Princeton closed off about half the street for outdoor dining and curbside pickup. Next slide. Okay, so what we did is we did what's called an online panel, which is a way to get a representative sample in a survey. And we did that just for New Jersey was our sample. We collected data. We started this working with Qualtrics, which is an online panel company, and collected data between November 30th and February 25th. And we were not aiming, our original plan was we kind of do this, after the peak. Turned out we did the survey during the peak. So people were still very aware of all these issues, obviously. And we obtained 1,419 respondents. And as you can see from the map, a pretty good distribution of response from the state. Those dots represent the zip codes that we got responses from. Next slide. So just to give you some results and some of the summary results. So we asked people on a scale from totally agree to somewhat agree to neither agree or disagree to somewhat disagree to totally disagree. And I've grouped the data by those on the agree side and those on the disagree side. And one of our key questions here is some streets should remain closed to support outdoor dining after the pandemic. About 40% agree with that, 30% disagree. And in the middle, they really don't have an opinion one way or another. They don't agree or disagree with that statement. So on balance, we're finding a plurality there, thinking they should remain closed. The same for parking spots to remain dedicated to supporting outdoor dining after the pandemic. I was actually surprised that we got more agreement on this because no one ever wants to give up parking spots. But the level of agreement there was 47% agreeing and less on the disagree side. Next slide. So, taking this question on some streets should remain closed for outdoor dining, we also had a question that asked people whether some accommodations had been made in their area for safer walking and cycling. And you see here that those that said yes, and that's the blue bar, tended to agree more with this statement that some streets should remain closed. And if we look at on the right-hand side, those that disagree, the no's are the highest there at 37%. So exposure to some sort of street closure seems to be correlated here with increased support. Next slide. We also asked people about what they thought this all meant for their town centers. And specifically, did outdoor dining arrangements have made the area more interesting and lively? And we get about 45% agreement with that. And outdoor dining arrangements have brought more people to the town center, about 38% agreement on that. And the disagrees on both of these are fairly small. Next slide. Now, there are always negative views about this. And the main things that people argue about, other than parking, is that it's going to cause traffic congestion. And so we asked people whether outdoor dining arrangements would cause traffic congestion on other streets. About 36% disagree, 31% agree with that statement. So again, the largest amount don't think that, plurality there do not think this is a problem. About 34% didn't see it as didn't have an opinion on it or didn't see it as a problem. Since restaurants and businesses have taken over sidewalk spaces, it's become difficult to walk in places. And we see a bit more agreement with that. I don't know whether that's seen as a negative or a positive, but some people will argue that's a negative. Go ahead, next slide. So we also asked about walking. And I'm sure most people observed that, especially during the lockdown, there was a lot more walking going on in your neighborhood. Just people, didn't have other activities to engage in at that time. A lot of people working at home. It was the only chance to get out of their house. So we asked, I walk more frequently for pleasure than I did before the pandemic. And 46% agreed with that statement. Okay. And I walk longer distances, about 38%. Okay, so we're seeing some shift there towards agreeing with that. Next slide. And we also cross-tabulated that question with whether or not there was an intervention. And we see even a larger fraction there that if you made accommodations made in the area for safer walking and cycling, about 69% agreed that they walked more for pleasure in that case, and much less on the disagree side. Next slide. So, one thing everyone knows, and a lot of people say, oh, everything's going to change post-COVID. And first of all, we don't really know. But we did ask people about walking before and during COVID. And those blue bars are, and also bicycling, which is on the right-hand side. The blue bar is before, and the red is during. It's not actually after, because we asked this in terms of during. And this is just showing the frequency of walking, 5 or more days a week to never. And my interpretation of this is there's really no change either before or during. Now, that kind of conflicts with what I just showed you, but I think it probably reflects more that people are doing different types of walking. Before maybe you're walking to your from your parking spot to work or something, and now you're walking in your community more. And that's something we need to look at in more detail. I have 30 seconds. Go next slide. I'm almost done. So our key takeaway, all things equal, walking about the same during the survey period than before the pandemic, but we get this, think there's a change in the type of walking done. Okay, an increase in recreational and also some utilitarian walking. I didn't show that part of the slides. There's a large association between street changes, support active travel, and self-reported walking, and a sizable association between those street changes and support for the outdoor dining and continued street closures. Next slide, I think that's it. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Bob. Mike's up next.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. I am going to talk about tactical, actually, not just too practical, but it can be very practical in the face of emergency or something like a global pandemic. Next slide. So quickly, we, before the pandemic hit, have worked a lot on defining and implementing tactical urbanism as a methodology for delivering projects and working with community to deliver those changes to streets and public spaces. Next slide. We've defined it historically as an approach to creating long-term change in a very intentional way, thinking about a vision for the long term, thinking about a plan or a process, and then very quickly trying to implement and iterate to learn, and then of course build political will and support for long-term investments in the public realm and in our transportation system. Next. But of course, that definition, like so many things, got challenged by COVID in March of 2020. And so the rules of the game changed quite a bit in the way we think about the spatial allocation in streets. Of course, we've always been thinking about giving people walking and cycling and taking transit more space in our towns and cities. But the reason, obviously, and the risk and being close together became more pronounced. At least at the beginning, we thought, the proximity on sidewalks, et cetera, was a real risk moving around. So you saw these very interesting responses pop up literally overnight as cities and citizens began to manage and deal with the crisis. Next. So when we think about managing change and delivering change, we often think about different phases or different ways you can do that, from the different types of engagement to the materials to the maintenance implications, and how you would eventually wind up with a long-term lasting investment while also conferring the benefits and values that these changes bring in the near term. So it's a way to fast track those improvements and learn what's working and not along the way. With COVID-19 responses, we really saw most cities kind of playing in this, testing things out for a few months seasonally, or for committing to the period of a year, or how long the pandemic would last, or the lockdowns would last. And now we're at this phase where things are kind of going in either into interim design or even long-term, from either policy or materials investment, or they're backtracking and sometimes being removed. So really interesting to see how that's evolving, just depending on which community you might be living and advocating within. Next slide. So we, alongside NACDO, developed an emerging practice and a guide for communities to respond to the pandemic, but I think most importantly also how to recover, how to think differently about our streets and public spaces, knowing back in May when we published this guide, how much we were going to learn and how much could be brought forth about the long-term investment that could be coming. Next slide. So there's guidance there on all sorts of things, from service delivery to walking and cycling and transit, how to do outdoor graduations, civic events, et cetera. Just really envisioning a complete a complete rethink of the way that our public space and public realm is managed and designed to support, public life was really the long-term play here, but of course, responding to the immediate demands of the pandemic. Next. So we've seen that across New Jersey. We've been involved with a few projects across a couple different communities. You've seen from the outdoor dining, the walking, the cycling, the public space, the retailing, all happening outdoors as a form of resilience, as a way to respond to these conditions and to do that very quickly, perhaps without an intent for long-term change. And so really rethinking the tactical urbanism definition to really being about response to an immediate and current condition, and not necessarily just about thinking long-term and acting in the short term to get things started. Next. So I'm going to enter these 6 points. How do we ensure tactical urbanism is practical urbanism, right? How do we transition something from the very temporary and interim from a year, from a pandemic response, to something that can be long lasting? And I'll hit just 6 points, and of course there's several more, but we'll cover what we can in this time allotment. Next. One, I think we've learned that you've got to lower the barrier to entry. Getting permission, whether you're a business, a property owner, a resident, and an advocate, to try things in the public space has always been a very challenging endeavor, costly and difficult. And so I think you've seen a real stifling of innovation on streets in America's cities and towns for a long time, because the barrier to entry is so high. And we've seen that by very quickly allowing restaurants to do this, or people to take over our streets for walking and physical activity, that really we can get out of our own way and allow this activity to flourish in our communities. Next. 2, being able to codify flexible streets. So I think thinking about things not just as one thing or another, but how we can manage streets based on the day of the week, time of the day, season of the year. Next slide. And then putting into place the measures, both physically, but also operationally, on how to do that. So everything from garbage collection and deliveries to when amenities might be rolled out or programming may happen in the public space. And I think this is a really wonderful example from Queens, where you see sort of these telescoping barricades or planters that could kind of come in and out based on the time of the day to allow different types of activities. Next. Materials selection and maintenance practices. When you put something out there really quickly as an emergency response, all these things are not meant to last. So just putting a pin in this for a second, like there really is a need to think about how very temporary materials evolve to the next phase, and then how to maintain those materials, even if they remain interim moving forward. Next. Of course, the social and economic context has been critical. I think a lot of people really reacted negatively to these quick interventions for a number of reasons, one of which was aesthetic, and what the cones and barricades and signs represent. And so here's a great example from Oakland, where they took a very different approach once communities pushed back on the initial materials that were used for street closures with their Slow Streets program. Next. Stewardship, putting all of the stewardship on local property owners or business owners or residents can be very difficult when it actually creates a lot of public benefit. And so thinking about how to move this into permanence, we have to think about how streets are managed functionally, and of course, from a programmatic perspective, to draw people into these new spaces that are created. Next. I think there's a huge opportunity to leverage and equitably distribute the value creation. If you go to the next slide, we've seen a huge amount of space reallocated to both public space, but also for businesses. And the revenue that's being potentially generated from businesses operating in the street, particularly restaurants and bars, is 488% higher than parking as usual, just parking revenue. And that's a calculation done here right in New York City, and that might change from place to place. But I think what we're saying really is that there's a huge amount of value created that can be reallocated to places that really need investments in streetscape and in the public realm. And so there's a real policy implication for how to make these things self-sustaining and more permanent and equitable. Next. And finally, you got to permit what you want to scale. If you like the response in different communities where you live or where you advocate, you've got to think about the policies, the materials, the programming, and the different players who will take part in making something more permanent to get it to scale. I think that's really a big missing piece from a lot of this work moving forward, is actually creating whole policies and programs behind this work. Next. So that I'll just say that, for the way we think about cities is that resilient cities can really start with resilient streets. And it's been amazing to see what's happened over the last year in communities, small and large, across the country and the globe, who've really proven this point out, that resilience really does start with the common spaces that we have together, which is in most places our streets. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mike. Betsy.
Hi, everybody. So glad to be here. So my name is Betsy Mastalio, and I work for the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. And I'm so glad to be here and to hear about everybody's great work and the response to COVID. And today I'm just going to share quickly a little overview of some of the things we've seen in the DVRPC region, particularly through the lens of our new program called Expo, which stands for Experimental Pop-Ups. Next. So as background, we are the MPO centered on Greater Philadelphia. We cover 5 counties in Pennsylvania and 4 in New Jersey. And Expo is our new program, which we hope is a sustaining program to help communities kind of execute these pop-up or demonstration projects. And the purpose sort of can be between placemaking and transportation, and can happen in both states. And we're hoping to work on multiple locations. And what we're really doing is we're looking for partners that we're finding all throughout the region that are willing to champion these projects because they've started a dialogue in their community and they have a timeline and a cost that's pretty attainable. And they're just looking for support to help navigate some of these beautiful pictures of projects that you're seeing happen. Next. So the program actually developed as a response through some of our partners. We had seen and heard a lot of things happening in our area. Mercer County had a great example of in Pennington going through to do some work in a residential intersection and putting in a sort of temporary or short-term roundabout that's really done well. And Mike and his team also worked with the Trenton Health team on Brunswick Ave in Trenton. So we were seeing a lot of this energy already taking shape, and we knew that our partners wanted some technical support. So next slide, please. So before the program really started, we got our feet wet through a project in Westchester. We were approached by TMAC, or the Transportation Management Association of Chester County, who had some design support from TPD. They were looking to really demonstrate some recommendations from a former DVRPC plan that had proposed things throughout the borough. And they wanted to show a demonstration of a parking protected bike lane. So we came out at dawn and we used tape and paint, and we worked to demonstrate something that really generated a lot of conversation in the community about what might be possible. Next slide, please. When the program started is actually when the pandemic was really taking shape, and we were beginning to hear a lot more from communities who were seeing a surge in cycling and wanted to take advantage of everything they were seeing in other communities, sometimes locally, sometimes nationally, and wanted to do something similar. So one of the first communities that approached us was the borough of Narberth. They had been having an ongoing conversation in their community about Windsor Avenue, which is the corridor that's kind of between their commercial and residential area. And they had been seeing a lot of bicycling going on in the borough. And in particular, they had seen a lot of bicyclists riding up the wrong way up a one-way street. And so they wanted to get something on the ground rather quickly while the weather was still nice, to engage in a conversation with the community about the future of one-way or two-way on Windsor, whether there's on-street parking, what these bicycle facilities could be. So we did a pop-up for 10 days, and we helped work with the Public Works using painting and striping some kind of makeshift signs that we either had produced or made, and then using kind of simple hay bales and cones to set an experience up for the community to talk about. And then we had a community survey, and we got data on all of the modes that were using the corridor during the pilot. So we were able to inform the neighborhood cycling club, the borough council, and staff on a conversation of where else they want to do pilots and how they want to engage in further conversation on Windsor Avenue for the future. Next slide, please. Some other projects that we're working on in the pipeline that we're hoping can actually be out on the street this summer One project is in Collingswood, New Jersey, which just recently wrapped up a bike ped plan with a number of facilities in the borough. And the Cross County Connections TMA is interested in helping demonstrate some of these facilities throughout the borough. So we're talking now about the possibility of demonstrating advisory bike lanes on a portion of Atlantic Ave that would connect a park, the Collingswood Patco station, as well as a farmer's market, and would be up for several weeks, excuse me, and really demonstrate to the community not only a facility type, but how to engage. Next slide, please. We're also talking with the borough of Hatboro in Pennsylvania. Hatboro is centered, their downtown is centered around York Road, which had a road diet by PennDOT a few years ago, and they were left with an 8-foot shoulder in both lanes of traffic, in both directions. And during the pandemic, they were seeing a lot of people walking and biking in the shoulder, in particular because the sidewalks are narrow. And through the comprehensive planning process, they heard that they wanted better pedestrian facilities along the corridor. And they've taken the impetus of a number of things they have through outdoor dining and a number of things in their downtown to engage in a conversation with the DOT about using the shoulders now for shared bike and ped space as a way to draw residents from the north on York Road down to their downtown. And we're hoping to do that this summer. Next slide, please. Another project that Cross County Connections is interested in, and we're talking to them about, is the kind of continuity of creating a set travel pattern. So in this case, it's looking around the Ashland station and connecting the Voorhees Town Center with the Ashland station through a series of neighborhood streets. And so there's a lot of different street types, but it's creating sort of directional traffic. So some would be on neighborhood streets, and then some might be bike facilities that need a little zhuzhing in order to feel lower stress. Next slide. So one of the things that we're really seeing throughout these conversations with the communities that we've engaged in is all of the work that gets put forth from the conversations that are having at a community level. And I think something that's happened through the pandemic is all of these communities, some like Camden have been having these conversations for a while, but others like Evesham and Medford are beginning to think about lower stress streets and network and how to create complete streets and energizing the bike community. So we think it's great to be a part of these conversations early on. Next slide, please. That's a quick overview. I'm excited to engage in some Q&A with the other panelists. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Betsy. And before we get into our kind of moderated discussion, we just really wanted to quickly go through who we're engaging and how important it is to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion when you're coming up with where these tactical urbanism pilot projects should do. As I mentioned, I'm also a planner, not just the executive director downtown New Jersey. So I did work on Jersey City's Vision Zero project, and I just wanted to share a little bit of the data we came up with to help drive both our outreach and our recommendations. So, just crashes by the county across New Jersey, we see that the orange bars are your communities of concern, which I won't get into the how we come up with that statistic, versus though the non-communities of concern. And in every single county, both crashes per square mile and crashes per 1,000 impact communities of concern disproportionately to non-communities of concern. We took that and we looked at the similar information for Jersey City at the crash. We looked at the crash data, and again, the top bar in every case is the percent of, and we had to use block groups for anybody who's a census data geek like I am, but the percent of the block groups was small that were of whatever it is: families in poverty, people with limited English proficiency, female head of household, persons of color, elderly, and we looked at some other thresholds as well. In every single case, the percent of people was less than those impacted by crashes, regardless of severity. Then we mapped all of this. So you can see the carless households, the darker the green, the more higher propensity of carless households, and the dots are the crashes. And you could see they generally correlate. And so we took all of those together to make communities of concern. And so you could see over to the left kind of each of the algorithms, and then mapped over on the right where the crashes are relative to communities of concern. And so we took all that data. Ultimately, we came up with a high injury network. And if you kind of go back to that communities of concern and where the crashes were, again, it does correlate where the high injury network is. And so, the policy then was driven by all of this data and our concern for that. And so, we prioritized placemaking initiatives and infrastructure initiatives. We also wanted to make sure that the design reduced the need for police enforcement, and that we really wanted to redress the decades of inequitable investment. And anyone who's familiar with Jersey City, they often hear all the investments going downtown where the gentrifiers are. And so that really the investments are spread out and targeted to this high injury network in communities of concern. Looking at bus stop locations and making those better near high crash areas for carless households, making sure we do focused outreach for those experiencing homelessness, and that we're looking at vulnerable users like school children around parks, around transit hubs, et cetera. So, the point of this is really we ask you, as you're looking at these tactical urbanism approaches and then moving to making them practical, that you do consider your population and try to be equitable in what you do. So with that, I am going to, here's everybody's emails, which I will keep up for a couple of seconds while everybody takes their video off and joins me in Brady Bunch view. And we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. So I see everybody is here. So I will stop sharing. Great. Thank you. Oh, there's Betsy. She wasn't in my Brady Bunch for a second there. So thank you all. Wonderful presentations. I took notes as you were speaking. And so, one of the things that came to mind was kind of the lessons learned through these tactical urbanism, and how it's great to do this, because if you just spend all the money on a plan and putting in a permanent solution, you might miss that. Let's take an example in Jersey City where they didn't really think about the bus stops very well with some of the bike lanes and how they interact. And because it was temporary, people pointed this out. And so then they came up with a more permanent solution for that. Do you guys have other examples of how your tactical urbanism projects have kind of highlighted some of these conflicts and then been solved in implementation? I see Mike nodding. So you want to go first?
I mean, sure. Where to start? That's always the point of these projects, is to really uncover not just how people use the created infrastructure, albeit temporary in some form, but also how people who don't use it respond to it, right? Because those two things interact in the political realm so directly in various communities. But I would just think about Jersey City. I'm sorry to use another Jersey City example, but just going back to 2018, when we did a demonstration project there of the city's first protected bike lane on Bergen Avenue. Anyone knows it, in Journal Square. So it was a 4-lane street with quite a high volume of traffic every day. And so the idea was, well, we're not really sure what should go in the plan. This is all during the planning process for the bike master plan. What should go in the plan in terms of the recommendation? So, and this is a pretty difficult street with the traffic volumes. Let's just try a directional lane southbound on one side of the street and see how that operates. It's also something that was relatively easy to pull off from a demonstration weekend-long type project. But very clearly it became known that people wanted to go both directions. And in looking at the response and some of the data collected, it was going to be better if it was on the opposite side of the street. So what you can go out there now and see is a 2-way bike lane rather than a directional bike lane on the east side rather than the west side. And I think that's really proves out the value. Now what's there now is still, I would say, in an interim form. I think increased level of protection, higher quality paint and materials could be like the next phase there. Maybe investing in some bike signals, things like that could be the next phase there. But it very much took from the demonstration to kind of ferret out, how should we really spend the next increment of investment on this corridor And that was then the decision was made to go to that two-way facility, and they've collected some really interesting data around travel times and increase in city bike usage and other good things. So, constantly doing that data collection is really important. Even after you think you've won and gone forward and even done some form of interim, you got to keep analyzing and studying how this stuff is working, not only for the one quarter, but then to offer some insight into future investments in temporary projects in the future.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Betsy, did you have any examples you'd like to share?
Yeah, I was just going to agree with what Mike said. I think the changes that you can make during the demonstration are super important, not only to improve upon the design, but I just think it really helps to establish a conversation and a degree of trust. So rather than making it, oh, they're putting in a project, in the Narberth example, 2 days in, we were watching the feedback on the survey come in, every few hours we're checking it. And sometimes we got some feedback that was like really smart. And Public Works went out the next day and made some adjustments and tweaks. And I think that level of commitment really establishes trust that, you're hearing people and you're willing to adapt.
Bob, anything to add on this one?
I don't have anything on any specific projects, so no.
Okay. So there actually was a comment, and I just want to expand on that a little bit more in the chat about, other potential conflicts like garbage collection, delivery, snow removal, street cleaning. That's one I definitely see. The bike lanes are awfully gross often. Any solutions or thought into some of those conflicts that we've seen? And I think we've seen some pop up even, during COVID as well, since we were taking parking spots and maybe taking away some of the curb space that was being used for other things. You're on mute, Mike.
These are all the issues that have to be worked out. And I would assert that they're much easier to work out in the real world on a real project where you can operationally see what's a pain point rather than predicting or trying to predict what the issues will be. It's hard to solve for every variable in a town or city, right? And some of that is going to be about equipment. Sometimes communities just don't have the right types of plows, or they have trucks that might need to be adapted over the years, or different capital spends to better fit the desired infrastructure and function of the street. I think there's a lot of solutions that can be that can come to fruition if we start to think about the curbside not just being sacred for parked vehicles. Once that becomes more of a flexible space, and all of a sudden you've got more space for the operational components, for delivery zones, for ride hail pickup and drop off, for garbage corrals, things that actually speed up and make more efficient and safe the curbside operations that happen in the city already, but do so with the barrier of constantly parked cars makes it tough to do all these things as well. So we can't forget that being a fact too.
I think that's a great point, talking about cars, how our roads are designed for cars, and the engineering and the warrants are all about how many cars can we get through. Why don't we shift a little bit to I know in our pre-meeting, for everybody else who wasn't there, we had quite the conversation about policy and how it impacts what the locals can do. What are some major policy shifts we really think we need to see to be able to have these things come to fruition? Betsy, would you like to start? I know you have some research on some things, particularly in Massachusetts, they've done really good that hopefully we can emulate in the future.
Well, sure, I can try to speak for Massachusetts. We all know that that's not my territory. But if for anybody who has been following, the DOT has, together with the foundation, done a tremendous job this year of doing probably hundreds of temporary to permanent projects. And it's really created kind of a whole new process for the DOT, where they've just streamlined the design process and kind of getting all the buy-in. So I think the limitations there might be with some of those projects that you have to make it ADA, and you have to have some sort of approval from your community to be able to do it. So that ensures that we're all prioritizing safety, and we're all trying to do something that the locals as experts have some say in, and they can do the design rather than trying to oversee everything through every step, and allowing for that flexibility, building it in.
Great. Bob or Mike, you have anything to kind of
Uh,
add to this policy
Well,
discussion?
you know, the state DOT, and I hope there's no one from there listening, but, you know,
Or
they're
maybe we do hope they're listening.
maybe we do. You know, they're using policies that prohibit municipalities in New Jersey from, you know, taking action. And I think a lot of these demonstration projects show how feasible it is to do things quickly without worrying about, you know, from a transportation engineering perspective, we're always worried about, and I shouldn't say we, they are always worried about traffic flow, moving the vehicles through as quickly as possible. But actually, we want to get the people to the places they want to be. I always think about, and I should add safely also. I always use the example in New Brunswick of Livingston Avenue, which, if I got my dates right, I think it was 2014 or so when we finished a study to do a road diet there, that the city then decided they wanted to implement after a crash that occurred. And we're now in 2021. I know about a year ago they started work on this, but they spent a lot of money on extra design work and studies when they just could have gone out quickly and done the road diet very quickly, cheaply, fast and cheap, and made the road better. And then they could have worried, you know, they're putting new signals in and things like that, which are all required by federal or state guidelines, that they have to upgrade their signal system, which just adds to the cost and adds to the delay to making the road better.
Mike, anything to add on this point?
A ton, but I'll try to be brief. I'll be brief. I think there really is this sort of nested problem or nested challenge of policy and guidance. So, you know, all the way from the battle we're waging right now across the country to try to reform the MUTCD, which then impacts decisions at a state, county, local level on what's permissible, to a state DOT, many of which have good policies on the books already. In fact, complete streets, et cetera, have good guidelines with design guides already adopted. But then how you translate that into actual work and projects on the ground, I think speaks to Bob's point, which is really important, that the pilot, the demonstration, the interim design, that is the study, right? You don't need to do a study to do a project that's intended to try things out. So I think operationalizing that through a policy from NJDOT or at the county level would do a lot to clear space for communities to try these things out in a measured way and create guardrails on this. You don't want people doing insane things, all over the map here, but I think you can have a lot of room for trying new things on our streets, which are clearly in high demand based on the response, particularly in walkable town centers and walkable neighborhoods, to make some of these changes. I think there's a huge political will for that. And then finally, I'll just go back to my point earlier that we're really missing the boat here on value creation. What people pay for parking at the curbside is way undervalued for that space. So let's look at the economics. Look at the policy here from an economic perspective, and how do we create equity and create financial resource through the value that's hiding in plain sight, and reinvest that in place in other places that need that investment in a community. So if we could put some policies behind that, I think we might also find more resources than we think that we currently have, because we're wasting them with just lowly cost or free, cheap parking. So there's a lot of value out there to be uncovered.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's not true value. We had this conversation a little bit about, we don't have local sales tax. So I think in places where there is a local sales tax and they look at the revenue that you can generate from dining tables in a parking spot versus the revenue you can generate from that meter in the same amount of time, it can be tremendous, but we don't have local sales tax in New Jersey. So there's
Sure.
no getting that revenue.
Right,
For,
but you have other tools, right? You can price parking more appropriately.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right? There's all sorts of tools that are already out there. You just have to operationalize them to, get that turnover, get different, variable uses at the curbside to free up the space.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was up in Quebec, first of all, a great restaurant row. Most of them had some type of outdoor seating situation going on. And then the rest of the parking spaces that were available in that kind of main core, it was 15 minutes. It was, go pop in, get whatever it is you want, pop out. And the whole goal was not to have people sitting their cars there. And then actually, if you went further down the road and the parking was much higher priced when you did park on the street down the road. And that made a walkable, approachable community. It's something that seems to have, at least until recently with COVID, was lost here. And like I said, now we do get a lot of towns asking, how do we make this permanent? What happens when we go back to normal? Are people going to want those parking spaces again? And I think we have to kind of take advantage of what we're giving here. And so to talk about that, you mentioned lowering the barrier to entry, and some ways towns can actually kind of take control of this. And I have a couple of examples, and hopefully you guys do too. One, I know a lot of the towns stopped charging for outdoor seating, cafe seating, inclusive of, if they went out into the street. And then great thing that Roadway did, shout out to them. I don't know if they're here, but they actually had paid an engineer or an architect, something, to design 3 parklets plans for them. And they gave those 3 plans to all the businesses, said, if you use this plan, easy approval, no fee, it'll turn around quick, have at it. So they eliminated the barrier pretty much there. Other examples of what towns can do to help their businesses through.
You cut the bureaucratic tape. I mean, I think the thing here in New York, we had almost 11,000 restaurants trading outdoors overnight because it was like, here's the safety checklist, here's the life and safety checklist. You meet these 3 things, you're good, and you can self-certify. We're going to come back later and make sure you're, we've had some very small issues around the margins with that, but we'll come back later and we'll inspect to make sure that you followed through on what you said you would. I think conferring that trust in businesses or property owners is something that needs to be explored further in every community, because the benefit is so clear from a placemaking, public realm, retail sales recovery perspective. So I think finding ways to do that, and the templates are a great idea. In Jersey City with the overnight use of the curb lane for dining, we helped them. Barker Patel called us on a Thursday. By Monday, they had the first ones under construction. We just the most basic guidance on paper that someone can look at, follow, and start to change the curbside is how this really all began. And then you see the embellishment over time, the adaptation for winter, then back to summer. People spruce these things up and start to invest in them, over time, where they actually become really unique, beautiful parts of the streetscape. So just get the bare minimum out there to start, and then let people do their thing.
And Betsy, is your organization, I know you're doing these pilot projects, because there was also early on in COVID, a lot of confusion and inconsistency. So, one town's engineer would say, you have to have these big concrete ballards, which we all know were in high demand and there weren't enough. And then another town said, no, you can do this. And there was just seemed to be no consistency or guidance really. And it was kind of the Wild West. Anything that, were you providing any guidance, DVRPC, or is that something we should push for, more kind of higher level guidance to make it easier when it comes down to the local?
I definitely think that helps. And there's a lot of communities that have done that. Like Burlington, Vermont, for several years, I think has had like a quick built guide with guidance like that. That's been really helpful. And I've actually heard some people say in our region, we should have some guidance. I think it's helpful when it comes to the municipality or a particular roadway owner. I think, as an MPO, it would be like this in between general and specific, because the amount of, we've got 2 different states, we've got different DOTs, different transit agencies, but I certainly think that it's very helpful if you can get it at the right scale.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's going to lower the barrier to entry.
Go ahead, Bob.
Guidance is useful until it becomes the policy and stops innovation. So you want to maintain some sort of ability for communities to innovate and find new ways of doing things.
And I completely agree. I think once it's on paper, it's kind of on paper already. And I think one of the most interesting things has just been the conversation to say to someone, do you think this is the right thing? Can we try this? What if we did something like that? Because we all kind of vibe off of each other. And when someone takes a further leap, then someone else has permission to do that. And I think it just gets so much more interesting that way.
Great. So I'm going to go back to some questions. We've got about 10 minutes. Some of the questions I've been seeing in the feed. And some people did give us questions when they registered as well. This one I found interesting. What's the longest lasting temporary treatment you've recommended or seen?
I mean, I'll let the cat out of the bag. Most of these things last a lot longer than you think they will, unless they're really intended to be for, a week or, a weekend or whatever. But, down the street from where I work, we've had a plaza that was installed with paint and, the typical quick build materials in 2007. It's still there in that form. It's now going under reconstruction, but that's 14 years later. So when we design our projects, both from a maintenance perspective and a materials perspective, we build in assumptions that things will last longer than the client states that it will, unless there's a hard removal date for a specific purpose. But they're intending it to last, well, until we get that capital budget, set in 3 years, it'll be this. Oftentimes those priorities change and that project might be there for longer, and that has maintenance implications, programming, materiality implications. So you've got to think about those things in advance.
Great. Betsy or Bob, anything to add, or shall we move on?
Well, I don't know, I can think of one intervention made in the city of Berkeley in California, about 1974, when they put out all the bollards and such to control traffic, with the plan that eventually these would be made pretty and such, and some of them have over the years, but some of the original ones put out, I don't know how many years ago is that now, over 40 years, almost 50 years ago, are still there. And they work, but
it could be prettier.
They could be prettier and more
They work.
attractive.
That's definitely the truth, is like some of them temporary means it just stays. That's a really long example, Bob.
Yeah.
But for the other shorter ones, I think that's why it's helpful to have kind of try to define what that objective is and what you're trying to learn and why it's a short-term project as opposed to a long-term. So if you just want a community to experience something, it could maybe be a shorter time frame than if you're actually trying to see if you have traffic impacts or delays, or if people start switching, then that's got to be a longer thing to see how that actually plays out. So the clearer you can be with what you're trying to find out, the more you can kind of make those decisions along the way.
Great. So there, I see the ever prescient parking question. How do you explain, convince, or whatever to remove parking for these types of things? Bob, clearly your survey showed that people were okay with it, and they're okay with it now because you're driving less. But what happens when we do get back to normal, if we do get back to normal, and you're removing parking? And I know, Mike, it probably first thing is your parking priced right? Yeah, if it's so cheap, then getting rid of it, the value proposition there. Any other kind of arguments or conversations you've had, any of you, about parking?
Well, parking is always controversial. And as I said, I was surprised that that was supported more than closing the street. So, there's potential there. People understand that there might be more value to using a parking space for some other purpose than a car.
Everyone needs to eat, and not everyone bikes, right? Or not everyone, wants to be in the street for other, transportation reasons. So other than driving. So I think what's been so powerful about the pandemic is the dining experience in the street has been so convincing to people, because it's such a common element that we share as humans, to want to gather with family and friends and eat. So I think that's been way more powerful than, say, let's take out the car parking and put in a bike corral. But I would say that a lot of this really does have to start with small increments. You have to start with the weekend, the week, the month, and say, look, if it doesn't work well, you're right, we were wrong, and we're responsive, and we're going to put the car parking back in. But if you tell somebody that's going to be something permanent from the outset, and that's just the direction we're going, in a lot of places that can be a recipe for no action. So that's why, the tactical is practical, is that you've got to get where you're going, you've got to start with something very, very short-term and interim, and then kind of build on that when people realize that, the sky doesn't fall.
And realistically, if you take 2 blocks and close off the street, or take the parking there for dining, you're not taking that many parking spots. And a lot of these towns have plenty of off-street parking that can be used. It's people just don't realize they can use it and they don't want to pay as, it usually costs more than the on-street parking. They don't want to pay for it. They'd rather look for a parking spot that's not there.
Which gets to the point, yeah, make that garage cheaper than it is to park on the street, and they'll
Yes.
do it. It's
Yes.
all about, which a lot of towns do. Or they'll offer, I was in Metuchen, it's free parking on the weekend in the deck, but you still got to feed the meter on the streets. Betsy, and I think Mike kind of churned my head. It's also about asking, right? And making sure, and I know you were doing surveys along with your project, so you were getting real-time feedback from people on how this worked. Anything to add about kind of that process and concept?
Oh, they'll come out that a lot of people are worried about the parking, and they'll let you know. So, a community survey and feedback is always going to include both sides. So I think you have to be prepared for what you want to do when both sides come out, and and who's gonna is anybody gonna decide, or is that how you work it through? I think many cases, in the case of parking, there's a lot of like finger pointing of who's parking there. They don't live here, they live here. Oh, they're parking, they're illegally, they have parking over there. So maybe, if you unpack that a little bit more, you can find out something else about your community that isn't so finger pointing.
Yeah. And I think it's good to collect that. I think the data point is important, and it's both having the data before you did the project, so knowing, and then asking after. So for example, we're going to throw out Jersey City again. The Ped Mall was they did it on weekends at first, and then it was the summer, and they just slowly progressed into it. And they, there were businesses who were, oh, my business is going to get shot, etc. And so I don't think they actually actively asked people what are your numbers today and what are your numbers later. But there were some of the merchants came out and said, actually, my business is doing better with the foot traffic than we were somebody maybe possibly perhaps being able to get a parking spot in front of my business. So I think it's good to engage and recruit, particularly if you're doing some street closures around your businesses, those businesses to give you data and keep you informed. See, go ahead.
Well, really quick point. I think you have to think obviously about the businesses that are here today, present day, but as planners, we're also thinking that in 10 years time, the business makeup might be very different. And so some people might have been attracted to a main street because it's absolutely cheap parking. It's easy for them as a business owner, for their customers to park there. Whereas future people might really look to that amenity of the pedestrianized street or the more pedestrian friendly street as the amenity that they want because they get more space, right? So I know we need to be responsive and include and be engaging with our current business community on main streets. But there's also this idea that we have to remember that there's more people coming and there's untapped demand for changes that aren't currently present on the street.
Great.
Yeah, especially if you can make it enjoyable and fun and motivate people to like that option.
Right.
Great. So I'm afraid to ask another question because we only have 2 minutes, but there was some question about bike lanes and people getting confused if there's a cycle track on one side of the street and basically they're going against traffic and how that works out. I know, Mike, you engineer a lot of these or design a lot of these. Any is the conflict really a big deal, or people figure it out?
It depends on the context. I mean, it's really about mitigating the risk at the intersections primarily. There's some great places to do two-way bikeways, and I think why they're so attractive in older communities on the Northeast and East Coast, like throughout New Jersey and Pennsylvania, is that they're more spatially efficient, right? To put two directional lanes that are protected on a single corridor requires more space. So people try to go in that direction to save, honestly, to save driving space at the end of the day, or parking space. But I think through signs, signals is a big, change where you can just change when, give cyclists a head start, through a leading interval, through their dedicated signal or using the pedestrian signal. It's probably the easiest and fastest way to, control for some of those conflicts, which people get so concerned about. But overall, when they're applied to streets where they're appropriate, people adjust really quickly. I think you also can increase the amount of ridership. And so sometimes you see an uptick in crashes, but you forget to remember that you have actually more ridership as well. So you want to look at that proportion. And if there's ongoing problems, then it's time to reevaluate, right? So it's time to think about a different design. So that's why these these demos are so important.
Yeah.
I
And again,
would-
it's keeping the data, right? Knowing that the ridership's going up. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, no, I would just add that, the other thing to think about, we haven't discussed it at all, is all the new mobility options that are here already and what will be there in the future, and providing space for those. And how do we accommodate those safely? And it's going to be a big issue, I suspect. Someone had a comment about wheelchairs and mobility scooters and such. So that's another component.
Well, and with that, we are at 5 o'clock, and I know we're trying to keep to strict time. So I think the presentations were great. Our conversation has been great. Thank you to all of you who there was a great conversation going on in the chat. So I'm glad we used that instead of Q&A and good questions. I hope we provided you all with some good info to go forward and plant that tree, to bring back to my analogy from the beginning of the day. So again, thank you all.
Okay, thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.